Hi, everyone. Professor King here. Today, I'm going to be talking to English 102 students. In this video, I'm going to be discussing two literary terms, foreshadowing and suspense, because the two stories that we'll be covering have a lot to do with those terms. They have clearly other terms, as all works of literature do, literature and narrative, but today we're going to be focusing on those. As I like to say, as always, if you have questions, comments, if you need clarification, please feel free to contact me, Zoom, Canvas, my email, Pronto, whatever else works. I'm here to help. I'm trying to use less because somebody left a couple of really comments in my comments section. And I know that I use those fillers a lot, but hey, guess what? I'm an English professor, not a comm professor. So I can do what I want. Plus we're teaching during COVID when everyone is treading water. So if there's an every once in a while, I think there are worse things in the world, right? Yes, I am sensitive and I take things personally, just like everyone here. So just keep that in mind. See, I almost said I caught it. I'll take it to the share screen now. I'll pull up the PowerPoint. It's going to be a quick one. We only have 2 slides to go over, so I hope that works for everyone. Here we go. Let me just make this a slideshow. All right, so as you know, we are in the short story section of our course. We've already gone over poetry. We've talked about various elements of literature in these literary terms. In continuation of our discussion of a short story, we're going to talk about foreshadowing and suspense. These happen a lot of times in texts, in film, in narratives, even in songs that have perhaps a horror or science fiction or dramatic or suspenseful element to them. But really, they can even occur in things like comedy. It just, if you think about the effect on the audience, on the reader, and what the writer is trying to achieve, and why the writer would try to elicit such an emotional response, an appeal to pathos, if you will, out of the audience, given that particular kind of text, then you start to see why these are important literary terms to know. So foreshadowing, there's this great quote by Anton Chekhov, very famous writer, wrote novels, plays, all kinds of stuff. And Anton Chekhov, I don't know why I can't say Chekhov today. Anton Chekhov said, he's dead now, but again, let's keep it all in the eternal present. He says, if in the first act you introduce a gun, by the third act, you have to use it. I recently just finished a television show, and I won't say which one because I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but I was watching the television show, and the very last episode, a character says he's going to grow out a ponytail in a year. He has short hair. He says he's going to grow out a ponytail. So immediately, because I am a student of literature and because I think about how texts, how narratives, how drama and short story and poetry are constructed, when that character at the beginning of this finale said, I'm going to grow out my hair in a year, I knew that at some point, probably at the end of the television show, which was the whole end of the series, that we would have a leap a year into the future. It's not because I'm smart. It's not because I'm psychic. It's because this is a very common approach, a common mechanism, we'll say, for writers to utilize. I've said this about 1 billion times before. You've probably heard me say this in a lot of different videos, but writing is deliberate. Every single thing you put in a text, whether that's a scholarly essay, whether that's an in-class essay, whether it's a short story, whether it's a poem, everything you put into a text has to be there for a reason, and it has to be intentional, and it shouldn't be superfluous or extraneous. It's just exactly what you need for that narrative or for that argument to advance. And so someone watching a text, in this case, a television show, and hears or sees a character say, I'm going to grow a ponytail out in a year, knows that that shouldn't just be taken as, oh, whatever, right? That they just wanted to fill time. If it's a good writer, and I believe that the people who wrote this television show are great writers, that's intentionally put in there. And sure enough, that ponytail comes back around at the end of the episode, and we see that it's jumped a year ahead. So think about that. If you have a gun in the first act, by the third act, you have to use it, because everything in the text is intentional. Everything is necessary. There's nothing in there that's additional or again, not relevant to the text. And so how does this all fit into foreshadowing? Well, foreshadowing is, as the definition says, the use of specific phrases, images, motifs, or character behaviors that signals events to come later in the narrative. That should be signals. I'll change that. We don't realize a lot of time that it's happening while it's happening. But if we are attuned to foreshadowing, if we know that this is a literary element that is used in a variety of texts, in a variety of genres, then we know when we see something and we say, that's peculiar. I wonder why that gun is sitting on the table in Act 1. Then by the end of the play or the film or the novel or whatever, what have you, we see that again. We know, not only was this device necessary for the furthering of the plot, but it also carried some sort of perhaps metaphorical or thematic or just topical or argumentative role within the context of this entire text, right? So foreshadowing is important because, especially in creative writing, in essay writing, we don't do it as much, because in essay writing, you have to tell the argument right off the bat, right? You're not coy, you're just there's the argument, and here I'm going to explain it, right? But in things like short stories, in things like plays, films, television series, what have you, we tend to do it a little differently. We tend to tease out that meaning slowly as the plot progresses, because if film and television and short story, if they were like essays, they'd be really boring, because you'd know everything that happened right out the gate. That's why they're creatively done. That's why these artists who create these texts are so brilliant, right? Because they can manipulate all of those things, and they can use all these seemingly pointless or innocuous sort of tools to build to something really great. And talking about building up to something, let's discuss suspense. Suspense and foreshadowing can go together. They don't always go together, but particularly when we're talking about things like horror or suspense or action films, sometimes they do. So what is the definition of suspense? It is the audience experiencing essentially a sensation, an emotion, when it feels an enjoyable anticipation mixed with fear or trepidation of what comes next in a story. Think about that. It's almost like pleasurable displeasure. And I feel like we could roam down a path of Freudianisms by just talking about that. But it's an enjoyable anticipation that's mixed with fear and trepidation. So you're watching because on the one hand, you want to know what happens next, but on the other hand, you kind of don't. So there's this commingling of these feelings that are in tension with one another. And if we think about the way that suspense feels, that's exactly how it feels, as a tension. Unless, we're so sort of jaded on it, or we had some sort of unique upbringing where suspense was common, and so it doesn't elicit those feelings in us. But for most people, it should elicit that tension of anticipation and trepidation. when done correctly, it tells the audience, pay attention to a particular scene. It's build up. And that's why I say sometimes with foreshadowing, they work together. Because if you have something in act 1 or act 2 that then builds and shows back up and plays a role in act 3, you need that build up, right? That's not the only way you can utilize foreshadowing, but it is one that's helpful, particularly again in things like horror, science fiction, action, etc. So if you look at the poster, there's a really famous horror movie that I'm sure everyone has heard of because there's been about 87 of them put out at this point. But the original Halloween had a very famous theme song to it, John Carpenter's Halloween. And John Carpenter actually, the guy who made the film, also did the music. And so this is fascinating if we think about it. This shows us how writing and directing and music, they're all arts, right? They're not all the same type of art, clearly, but they're all art forms. And an artist like John Carpenter, who has a particular message or impression that he wishes to impress upon his audience, is going to craft his art in a particular way in order to do that. John Carpenter's been considered a master of suspense, for his, well, he was for his entire life. And he knows what he's doing. You can disagree with that. Maybe you hate his movies. That's fine, right? I'm not here to sell you on a 40-year-old movie. But what I am trying to tell you is that he thinks about what he's going to utilize in his text, what sounds, right? If we're talking about music, it's going to be the sounds, it's going to be the beat, it's going to be the instruments, it's going to be the pitch and tone. Now, if he's directing, he's going to utilize an entirely different set of tools, but he's achieving an overall impression, just like he would in a song, right? He's trying to achieve fear or frisson, what they call frisson in the audience, or trepidation, anticipation, disgust, terror, whatever. And both of these, whether it's the song that you'll hear in a moment, whether it's the films he's created, there are these working systems where all of these elements work together to create that overall dominant impression. It's not just one instrument. It's not just one character. It's a character, it's a scene, it's the entire plot, it's the setting, it's the imagery, the symbolism, the metaphors, right? It's not just the one instrument in the song, but it's the instrument, it's how it's played, it's who's playing it, it's how long it's played for, it's what other instruments it's played with. So all of these things, these necessary elements work together, created by the writer, the artist, the rhetor, whatever you want to call them, and are then experienced by the audience. And then we respond. All of this is communication. All of this is a conversation spoken in art form that we then get to have as long as these art forms stick around and we don't lose them. So I want you to listen to this song really quickly. And as you listen, I want you to just think about how you feel and what elements specifically of this text are making you to feel that way. Oh, yeah, that's good enough. Don't want to, don't want to play it too long, get busted for copyright infringement or anything. I'm just teaching a class, right? It's protected under the Fair Use Act. Okay. Any of the 5-0 or the fuzz is watching this to bust me on my, if they think it's a potentially illegal use of, again, a 40-year-old song. Oops, I said just kidding. So think about the song. Think about what's going on in this song. Think about the instruments. Like the people who always do best with this question are the music majors. But even if you're not a music major, if you don't know the name of the instrument being used, you can still hear the beat. You can still hear that there's this kind of high staccato, like dee, 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 right? But then it's interspersed with these every few beats, this bong, right? So you have this like sort of high vibration frequency with this sort of doom like sound, and then we sort of go down the scale to lower and lower, which kind of creates this sort of fear, dread, something bad is going to happen sense in us. And there's all other kinds of stuff going on that you probably mentioned, that you're like, as you're watching this video, you're like, Professor King, but there's also this. Yes, there's all those things. And the music majors would be able to tell you even more, and they'd be able to tell you in a way that is much more refined than the way that I'm explaining it. But just like the fact that I'm not a comm studies professor, and that's why I say all the time, I'm also not a music professor. So I don't know those words, but I do know art, I do know writing. And so that's what I'm sharing here. I hope that these are helpful. Again, in the text that we'll be reading this week, I want you to think about how these elements play a role in the overall furthering of the plot, in the symbolism that is provided, in the characters themselves and how they are developed, and what happens to them and by them by the end of the stories. I want you to think about the stuff in the stories, particularly for those of you reading Joyce Carol Oates's Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? That story, I want you to think about like, what the heck's going on? Because sometimes people read that and they're like, huh? It was scary, but I can't fully explain why. Think about how all of these elements are creating that in you, and why, and what they might, what those sensations or symbols or metaphors might stand for. So I hope this was helpful. And I hope that if you have questions, you contact me. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Why not? Why have a bad day if you can avoid it? Anyway, you all have a good one. I will see you in cyberspace.